Welcome to the class. Today we are going to look at another construction in English, that is another type of sentence construction in English language. This construction is called relative clauses. It's about a clause which is embedded within a larger sentence. Whenever we talk about a clause, we talk about a smaller part of a sentence. So, we are going to look at, in the context of understanding a sentence, we are going to look at relative clauses, its components and its function. We will look at it because understanding the components of specific constructions and how they function help us come over accuracy, and it is accuracy, it is our ability, developing our ability to come up with accuracy is what means a lot to learning of language. We are going to look at how it works. So, let's look at some of the sentences. The sentence is, the house which is red, the house which is red, it should be red, was built in 1975. The road which was narrow is being repaired. The building which is tall has been inaugurated. We are going to draw your attention specifically to the components of these three sentences that are in blue. And it is this part of the sentence which is called a relative clause. Important part for us to notice is this clause, and we are going to talk about that. We will talk about why we call it a relative clause and how it functions. So, look at this. If you look at this sentence carefully, we get the idea that this whole thing is one sentence. The road which was narrow is being repaired. This is full sentence. In this sentence, road is the subject and whole thing is predicate. If you focus on this part, the sentence is good without this part as well. That is, if you leave this part of the sentence is, the road is being repaired. It's a grammatical sentence, good sentence. The building which is tall has been inaugurated. If you leave this part, the sentence is, the building has been inaugurated. And if you leave this part in blue here in the first one, that is, the house which is red was built in 1975. If you leave this part, then the sentence is, the house was built in 1975. It's a good sentence. Now, if you look at each one of these clauses, they are called clauses because they are also like a sentence. The sentence that is part of another bigger sentence is called a clause. So, we call these sentences a clause because they are part of the larger sentence. So, this is the general understanding and definition of a clause. A clause may be a full sentence by itself, may not be a full sentence. But when a sentence is part of another bigger sentence, that sentence is called a clause. And also because the part of the sentence is somehow connected with the larger sentence. This is why each of these clauses have some names. Sometimes they are called subordinate clause, sometimes they are called relative clauses. That is, depending, these names get attested to them depending upon their functions. However, the larger sentence which they are part of is called main clause. So, we have main clause and a subordinate clause. That's how we understand clause. In these three examples, these are clauses. There is one more thing where I want you to pay attention. Each one of these clauses, they are saying something, they are adding some additional information about a particular noun. In one, this clause in blue is giving us information about house. The house was built in 1975. So, when we say the house which is red was built in 1975, it's giving us information about the color of that house. So, it's giving us information about this noun. In 2, the clause in blue is giving us information about road. It's telling us about the size of the road. The road was narrow. In 3rd one, this is giving us information about the building. So, this clause in a way is dependent on the main clause because it gives us information about the noun in a matrix sentence. The noun, which is in this case it is the subject of this matrix sentence, this relative clause is giving us information about it. So, now we understand something about relationship between a sentence and a clause. We also understand why we call a sentence in a bigger sentence a clause. And also we understand that a smaller clause in a way is contingent upon some element in the higher clause, that is larger clause, that is the main clause. So, we have the building which is tall is being inaugurated, which is tall is giving us information about the building. So, we see lot of things about it. What we need to know now is why are these smaller components of this sentence, these sentences, why are these things called relative clauses? We will talk about that in a minute. Let's look at more examples. And in these examples again, I have not marked any sentence. I have also not marked so far what is the noun that relative clauses are giving information about. So, in these sentences like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6, there are 6 sentences on this slide. What I want you to do is pause here and find out relative clauses in these sentences and also find out nouns which are connected with relative clauses, in the sense that the relative clause is giving us information about that particular noun. Find it out. So, when you move further, you will see the sentence is, she worked for a man who used to be an athlete. Now, this part is a relative clause. Who used to be an athlete? Who used to be an athlete? she worked for a man who used to be an athlete. So you will realize that this whole clause is giving us information about this noun. And in this case, this noun is not the subject of this sentence. Subject of the sentence is she. The predicate, in a way, this whole thing is the predicate, but worked for a man is the predicate, where work is the verb, and this is also in some way a man is part of this predicate. So, a man is the noun which is being modified in this sentence. So, the function with this example and the other examples that you have seen so far, what we can conclude is the function of a relative clause is to give us additional information about a noun, which is why this is called that this whole clause is modifying this noun. So, it's a clausal modifier. A noun is being modified by an entire clause. Now remember, does this remind you of anything? Are there constructions, are there components of a sentence which modify nouns? You don't have to work too hard. You will come to an answer that adjectives modify a noun. When we say tall man or short man or qualified man or any kind of adjective that we add, adjectives are words which modify a noun. So, in a way, you are going to see a similarity between adjectives and relative clauses, in the sense that relative clauses modify a noun and adjectives also modify a noun. Relative clauses usually occur to the right of the noun, they modify because it's a whole sentence, it's a heavy thing. So, in English, usually it occurs on the right of the noun, they modify. Right meaning, this is the noun, a man, it is modifying a man, and it is on the right side of that noun. So, there is a similarity between a relative clause and an adjective. Function-wise, an adjective has the same function as a relative clause, or we can say a relative clause in a sentence is exactly functioning like an adjective. The way adjectives modify a noun, a relative clause modifies a noun too. So, we understand the meaning of modifier. Any element, whether a full sentence or a small element like one word adjective, any element that gives us more information, that modifies a noun, is called a modifier. So, a relative clause is also a modifier, and adjective is also a modifier. So, therefore, functionally, there are functional similarities between a relative clause and an adjective. So, likewise, you can work on each one of these sentences. They called a lawyer who lived nearby. Should be easy for you to find out that who lived nearby is a relative clause and it is modifying the noun lawyer. The customer liked the waitress who was very friendly. The who was very friendly is a relative clause and it is modifying the noun the waitress. They lived in a city that is in the north of England. That is in the north of England is a relative clause and it is modifying a city. Should be simple. The girl who is from India works in the bank. This part is a relative clause and it is modifying the girl. The waiter who was wearing the blue shirt was rude. So, in this case, in sixth sentence, the relative clause who was wearing a blue shirt is modifying this noun, the waiter. So, what's going on here? You see, in these examples that we have identified the nouns that are being modified. We have also identified the clauses that are modifying those nouns. Now, what do you observe about these relative clauses? We observe that in each one of these examples so far, a total of 9, we see every relative clause begins with a word like this, who. In this sentence also we see who, in this sentence we see that, in this sentence we see who, in this sentence also we see who, in this sentence we see who. So, in most of these sentences, all these 6 sentences, we find relative clauses which begin with who. And we find one example where it says that. So, we see 2 things, who and that. Relative clauses are beginning with these terms. If we look at these 3 examples, in this we see relative clauses have which, all 3 of them, it's which. Does it remind you something? Does it? So, words like who, which, do they not remind you of WH question words? These are question words in English. Now is the time for us to understand that a word which begins with WH elements and are called question words. These words have multiple functions in the language. In this case, which, who and that are not question words. So, in some context, same word functions as a question word. In this context, these words, which are like question words, are functioning as relative pronouns. So, the other function, words like who, which, when, and some more, these words also function like relative clauses, like relative pronouns in English. This is why you see them beginning with those words. As you know, the function of a pronoun is to stand for a noun. So, what is the noun that they stand for? These stand for the nouns they modify. So, if we break a relative clause in 2 parts, we can say the house. So, the sentence is the house which is red was built in 1975. We can say the house was built in 1975 and the house is red. So, we are replacing one house with this pronoun which is a relative clause, which is a relative pronoun. And since it's a relative pronoun, this clause which begins with this pronoun is called a relative clause. These clauses begin with a relative pronoun, therefore they are called relative pronouns, relative clauses. And it is this reason why it is this relative pronoun of the relative clause which is connecting this clause with the matrix clause, with the larger clause. And Thus, we understand why we call it a relative clause and what the functions of a relative clause are. We also understand relative pronouns. So, most of the question words who, which, where, when, that is a word which is not beginning with WH like which, who, where, when is also a relative pronoun. You know, that is a demonstrative pronoun as well. So, that has multiple functions. That has a function of a relative pronoun, that has a function of a complementizer, that has a function of a demonstrative pronoun. So, this word that has several functions in English language. So, I want you to pause here and do the following exercise for yourself. You come up with sentences in English which has these relative pronouns in them. So far you have seen in 9 sentences we have used who, which and that. Now I want you to come up with sentences where you can have where and when used as relative clause. Now, it is possible to use them as relative clauses. I only want you to come up with the sentences. Once you have come up with these sentences, I want you to check one more thing for yourself through these examples and also check the following in your own examples too. In this one, in the first sentence, she worked for a man who used to be an athlete. You see, a man is not in the subject position. They called a lawyer. The lawyer is not in the subject position, it is an object position. Whereas the girl who is from India works in a bank, the girl is in the subject position. So the point is, a relative clause can modify a noun in any position in a sentence. The noun can be in subject position, the noun can be in object position, the noun can be in adjunct position also. Irrespective of the position of the noun, a noun in a sentence in English can be modified by a relative clause. And it is the nature of the noun which decides the nature of the relative pronoun. Like we use he for animate masculine and her for animate feminine. You will see how relative pronouns are being used for different nouns. So, who is used for a particular category, which is used for a particular category, that is used for a particular category, and you will find that out. So, what I am trying to tell you here is, we understand the function of a relative pronoun. It has the function of modifier. It works as a modifier just as an adjective works. A relative clause begins with a relative pronoun, and it is this relative pronoun which connects relative clause with the main clause, that is the matrix clause. And all relative clauses will begin with a relative pronoun because it stands for, in that sentence, in that clause, it stands for the noun they modify. So this is a short discussion on a structure and function of relative clauses in our learning. How we learn a clause, how we learn a sentence. Together, how we learn a complex sentence. But please connect it with your understanding of a sentence, that every sentence is eventually a combination of a subject and a predicate. And a clause and a predicate will have verb and its objects and adverbs. A clause is part of a sentence. It could be an independent sentence, but as long as an independent sentence is part of the matrix sentence, it can be called a clause. So, whether it's a relative clause or any other kind of clause, though it looks like a full sentence, it's a clause in the sentence. And even a sentence with a relative clause within it is also only a sentence at the end of the day. So, with these things, when you understand sentences, your understanding of a sentence becomes richer. Your understanding of a sentence and functions of its different parts within becomes richer. You feel more confident about using more complex sentences, and eventually you feel more confident in understanding when others speak and you speak. That is how we understand a relative clause. We want you to look at the following things which we have elaborated, and with that I put one more assignment for you here. Rather, I draw your attention to a particular kind of thing which is connected with your reading. If you have been reading things like books, stories, novels, if you have been listening to news materials, now at this point pay attention to the sentences which has relative clauses in them and check their functions for yourself and see how relative clauses are being placed and how it works in our languages, in our learning, that is learning of English. I stop here. Thank you and look forward to your questions and look forward to an engagement in question and answer with you. Thank you.